The tinkling chime of the shop bell broke the heavy silence, announcing another visitor. The store stood on the corner of a bustling downtown street, a shimmering oasis amidst the grey monotony of concrete and asphalt. Its windows gleamed with a curated display of designer suits, Italian leather shoes, and custom watches, each piece positioned like a crown jewel. The store's name, Elijah Lux, was etched in gold script across the glass, simple, elegant, commanding attention without begging for it. Elijah Eli Daniels adjusted a cufflink on his charcoal grey blazer, standing behind the polished mahogany counter. He had designed the space himself, marble floors, warm recessed lighting, and plush armchairs in deep emerald green. The scent of rich cedarwood and bergamot lingered faintly in the air, adding to the aura of understated luxury. To passers-by, Elijah Lux was the epitome of success, a sanctuary for the affluent and stylish, run by a man whose tailored suits and calm demeanor suggested effortless elegance. But to Elijah, every inch of the store was a fortress, not against competitors, but against a world that seemed to question his right to occupy such a space. It wasn't just the occasional sideways glance from customers who underestimated him, nor the veiled skepticism from suppliers who hadn't met him in person. It was the weight of subtle, constant doubt he'd learned to carry. He knew how to mask his frustration with a charming smile, how to deflect microaggressions with measured responses. Still, there were days when the pressure gnawed at him, leaving him awake in the quiet hours of the night. Today felt heavier than most. A trio of customers browsed the racks, their murmured voices barely audible over the soft jazz playing in the background. 2 men and a woman, all in their mid-30s, dressed in what Elijah recognized as faux designer brands, flashy labels, garish colors. They walked with a swagger, their presence slightly out of sync with the serene ambiance of the store. Elijah greeted them earlier with his usual warmth, but their response had been lukewarm, almost dismissive. They wandered now, picking up items and inspecting them without care, their laughter occasionally breaking the quiet. From the corner of his eye, Elijah noticed one of the men, a tall, wiry figure with a buzz cut, shooting him furtive glances. The woman, her bright red nails clicking against a crystal-studded phone case, whispered something to the other man, who smirked and nodded. Elijah remained poised, his hands clasped lightly in front of him. His sharp instincts, honed by years of navigating spaces where he wasn't fully welcome, pricked at him. Something about their body language felt off. "Beautiful pieces here," the woman finally spoke, her voice saccharine yet hollow. As she approached the counter, she picked up a silver cufflink set from the display, letting it dangle carelessly between her fingers. "Must be nice owning a place like this." Elijah smiled politely. "Thank you. We take pride in offering timeless designs. Let me know if you need any assistance." The man with the buzz cut stepped closer, his tone mocking. "You own this place? Must have cost a pretty penny. Not bad for someone like you." The words hung in the air, sharp as glass. Elijah's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but his expression didn't falter. "I've been fortunate," he replied, his voice steady. "Hard work pays off." Buzz cut chuckled darkly. "Yeah, hard work. That's what they call it." The other man leaned casually against a rack of suits, his eyes scanning the room. "You ever have trouble, keeping this place safe? Seems like a spot like this would attract all kinds." Elijah's pulse quickened, though he didn't show it. His years of experience taught him how to read between the lines, and this conversation was veering into dangerous territory. "We've been lucky," he said carefully. "Our customers are usually respectful of the space." The woman laughed low and cruel. "Usually, huh? That's good. Wouldn't want any trouble in such a high-class establishment." Elijah's gaze flicked toward the security camera in the corner, its red light blinking steadily. He wasn't afraid. He had faced worse than veiled threats. But his mind raced through possible scenarios. Were they just testing boundaries, or was this leading somewhere darker? The trio lingered for a moment longer, their presence a storm cloud threatening to unleash its fury. Then, as if deciding he wasn't worth more of their time, they sauntered back to the racks, continuing their loud banter. Elijah exhaled slowly, his grip on the counter loosening. He reminded himself to stay calm, to wait and watch. He didn't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily, but he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. As the minutes ticked by, the trio's behavior grew bolder. They moved through the store with an air of entitlement, pulling items from hangers and discarding them carelessly. One of the men lit a cigarette, ignoring the no-smoking sign prominently. Displayed by the entrance, Elijah stepped forward, his tone firm but measured. "I'm sorry, but smoking isn't allowed in the store," Buzzcut sneered, taking a long drag before crushing the cigarette against a marble column. "My bad," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Before Elijah could respond, the shop bell chimed again. A delivery driver entered, wheeling in a large package. The interruption shifted the energy in the room, and Elijah used the moment to refocus. "Excuse me," he said, stepping away to sign for the delivery. But even as he handled the paperwork, he could feel their eyes on him, their laughter a low, mocking hum in the background. As the driver left and Elijah turned back toward the counter, his heart sank. The woman stood near the register, her hand casually resting on the display of limited edition watches. Her companions flanked her, their postures tense, their gazes sharp. The store fell eerily silent, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Elijah's instinct screamed at him this wasn't just idle mischief anymore. And then the moment snapped. Buzzcut reached into his jacket, pulling out a pistol. He waved it lazily in Elijah's direction, his grin predatory. "All right, big shot," he drawled. "Let's see how much that hard work of yours is worth." The woman opened her purse, pulling out a small black bag. "Fill it," she ordered, her voice losing its earlier pretense of sweetness. Elijah stood motionless for a beat, his mind racing. His calm facade never wavered, but deep inside, something stirred. A dark, dormant part of him that he had kept buried for years. For now, he played along, moving to unlock the display case with deliberate, steady movements. But as his fingers brushed the glass, his reflection stared back at him, sharp, calculating, dangerous. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Elijah Daniels kept his movements precise, his expression unreadable as he unlocked the display case. His hands were steady, though his mind raced like a high-speed train. He felt their eyes on him, mocking, daring him to react. Buzzcut shifted his weight, tapping the barrel of the gun against his thigh. "Hurry it up, boss man. We don't have all day." The nickname was deliberate, Elijah knew, meant to undercut his authority in the very space he had built from the ground up. But Elijah had learned long ago not to rise to the bait, no matter how sharp the barb. As he carefully retrieved the watches, laying them into the black bag with a calmness that belied the tension in the air, memories began to surface. Elijah wasn't always this composed. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Detroit, he'd spent his early years scrapping for survival. His mother, Ruth, had worked tirelessly to keep him off the streets, juggling multiple jobs to afford their tiny one-bedroom apartment. She'd always said he was destined for more than the corner blocks and dead-end dreams that swallowed so many others. "Promise me, Eli," she would say, her voice hoarse from long nights cleaning office buildings. "Promise me you'll find a way out. You've got a mind sharper than any knife. Don't waste it." But the world hadn't made it easy. By the time Elijah was 16, he had been arrested twice. Once for defending himself against an older kid trying to shake him down, and once for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each incident left a scar, not just on his record, but on his soul. It wasn't until Ruth fell gravely ill that Elijah began to see the weight of her sacrifices. watching her waste away in a hospital bed, her body frail, yet her spirit unyielding. Something clicked inside him. "You're going to make it, Eli," she whispered during one of their final conversations. Her hand, thin and trembling, gripped his with surprising strength. But making it isn't just about leaving the past behind. It's about proving to the world that they can't define you. Those words became his mantra, propelling him through every challenge life threw his way. The watches clinked softly as they settled into the bag, pulling Elijah back to the present. "Don't forget that one." The woman pointed to a diamond-encrusted timepiece in the corner of the display, her red nails clicking against the glass. Elijah nodded silently, retrieving the watch. As he placed it in the bag, the store's front door opened again. His assistant, Maya, stepped in, her arms full of shopping bags. Maya was a bright spark in Elijah's life, a recent college graduate with a quick wit and an unshakable loyalty to him. She'd been with him since the store opened 3 years ago, and her presence was both a comfort and a complication at this moment. Her cheerful expression faltered the instant she saw the gun in Buzzcut's hand. The shopping bags slipped from her grasp, their contents spilling across the floor. "Eli." "It's okay, Maya," Elijah said calmly, cutting her off before she could say more. "Just stay by the door." Buzzcut turned to her, his grin widening. "Well, look who's here. You got an assistant now, huh? Fancy place like this. I'm surprised you don't have a whole staff." Maya's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands trembling slightly as she backed toward the door. Elijah gave her a subtle nod, willing her to stay composed. "You almost done?" Buzzcut barked, turning back to Elijah. "Just a few more pieces," Elijah replied evenly. He was stalling, and he knew it. Every second bought him more time to think, more time to analyze his options. The store's security system was top of the line, and the silent alarm had already been triggered when Buzzcut pulled his gun. The police would be on their way, but Elijah wasn't sure they'd arrive in time to prevent something catastrophic. His thoughts drifted, unbidden, to another moment from his past, a moment when waiting had cost him everything. It was a hot summer night years ago when Elijah had found himself cornered in an alley by two men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. He had just turned 21, fresh off a hard-earned promotion at the auto plant where he worked. The extra money in his pocket had made him a target. They didn't expect him to fight back. Elijah could still feel the weight of the steel pipe in his hands, the raw fury that had surged through him as he defended himself. By the time it was over, one of his attackers was unconscious, the other writhing on the ground with a broken arm. The incident had shaken Elijah to his core. He hadn't meant to hurt them so badly, but in that moment, something primal had taken over, a side of himself he rarely acknowledged. It was the same side of him that stirred now, as he stood face to face with men who underestimated him yet. "You again." "All right," Elijah said, tying the bag shut and handing it to the woman. "That's everything." Buzzcut raised an eyebrow. "You're pretty calm for someone getting robbed." Elijah met his gaze evenly. "I've learned it doesn't help to panic." The room went still for a moment, the air crackling with unspoken tension. Buzzcut's grin faltered just slightly, as if he sensed something in Elijah's tone, something that hinted at deeper, darker waters beneath his calm exterior. The silence was broken by the distant wail of sirens, growing louder with each passing second. The woman's head snapped toward the door. "Cops!" she hissed. Buzzcut cursed under his breath, waving the gun toward Maya. "You! Lock the door! Now!" Maya hesitated, her eyes darting to Elijah. "Do it," Elijah said softly, his voice steady. She obeyed, locking the door and stepping back, her movements stiff with fear. Buzzcut glanced at his accomplices, his bravado slipping. "Let's get out of here. We've got what we need." But the woman shook her head. "Not yet." She turned her sharp gaze to Elijah. "You've got a safe in the back, don't you?" Elijah's heart sank. He knew the safe was empty. He never kept cash or valuables there for this exact reason. But there was no way they'd believe him. "I'm afraid the safe's not—" "Don't lie to me," she snapped, pulling a knife from her purse. "Take us to it. Now." Elijah's jaw tightened, his mind racing. The sirens were close, but not close enough. He glanced at Maya, whose wide eyes pleaded with him to do something, anything. The darkness inside him stirred again, louder this. "In time, I'll take you," Elijah said finally, his voice low. "But only 2 of you come with me. She stays here." He gestured toward Maya. Buzzcut frowned, but the woman nodded. "Fine, let's go." As Elijah led them toward the back room, the weight of the moment settled heavily on his shoulders. He knew this wasn't just about protecting his store or his assistant. It was about protecting himself from the part of him he had tried so hard to bury. And as they reached the door to the back, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a moment that would change everything. As Elijah led the 2 robbers toward the back room, the weight of the situation pressed against him like an unseen hand squeezing his chest. The dimly lit hallway stretched ahead, every footstep echoing in the otherwise silent space. Buzzcut walked behind him, gun still in hand, while the woman with the crimson nails followed closely, her knife glinting in the light. Elijah's mind churned, each second bringing him closer to a decision he wasn't sure he wanted to make. "You sure don't look like the scared type," Buzzcut sneered, his tone taunting. "Most people would be begging by now." Elijah glanced over his shoulder, his calm mask firmly in place. "Begging rarely changes the outcome. It's better to stay focused." "Focused," the woman repeated, drawing out the word as she twirled the knife between her fingers. "You talk like a man who thinks he's got the upper hand." She let out a cold laugh. "But you're outnumbered, big shot. Don't forget, in that—" Elijah said nothing, his gaze returning to the door at the end of the hall. He knew better than to engage further. Words would only fan the flames. Still, a flicker of something sharp and dangerous stirred in him, a reminder of the man he had been before he built this life of refinement and control. The memories came unbidden as they reached the door to the back room. It was impossible not to think of his father, a man whose presence had loomed large over Elijah's childhood. His father, Marcus Daniels, was a figure both feared and revered in their neighborhood. A man with calloused hands and a temper as sharp as a blade. He had taught Elijah how to defend himself, but the lessons were harsh, rooted in survival rather than love. "Never let them see you bleed," Marcus would growl, his voice rough from years of chain-smoking. "If they see weakness, they'll tear you apart." For years, Elijah had carried that mantra like armor, using it to navigate a world that seemed determined to break him. But his mother's influence had tempered him, teaching him that strength didn't always mean striking first. It was her voice he clung to now, her words that reminded him he had more to lose than his pride. Elijah unlocked the door, stepping into the back room with deliberate slowness. The space was utilitarian, starkly different from the opulent showroom. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with inventory and supplies. In the far corner sat the safe, an imposing steel box that was in reality little more than an empty prop. "Open it," the woman ordered, her voice dripping with impatience. Elijah hesitated, just long enough to weigh his options. His gaze flicked to Buzzcut, whose grip on the gun was firm but not steady. The man's bravado was clear, but Elijah could sense an underlying nervousness, the kind that made people unpredictable. "I'll open it," Elijah said finally, stepping toward the safe. As he knelt to input the code, he spoke again, his tone measured. "You know this won't end well for you." Buzzcut barked a laugh. "And why's that? You think your fancy cameras are going to scare us off? By the time the cops get here, we'll be long gone." Elijah straightened, his expression unreadable. "It's not the cameras you should worry about." The woman stepped closer, her knife catching the light again. "Enough with the cryptic nonsense. Open the safe, or I'll make sure you regret it." Elijah's hands moved to the dial, spinning it with practiced ease. He felt the weight of their stares, the tension coiling tighter with each passing second. His mind raced, calculating the distance between himself and his captors, the possible angles of escape. But even as his instinct screamed for action, he hesitated. And then he heard it. A faint knock on the back door, barely audible over the hum of the store's ventilation system. The sound was subtle enough to be dismissed as a coincidence, but Elijah knew better. Someone was out there. Someone who might be a threat or an ally. "Who else is here?" Buzzcut demanded, his voice sharp. "No one." Elijah lied smoothly, his mind scrambling to adjust. But the knock came again, louder this time. Buzzcut cursed under his breath, motioning for the woman to check it out. "Go see who it is. I'll handle him." The woman hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she studied Elijah. "You try anything while I'm gone," she hissed, "and you won't live to regret it." Elijah said nothing, his calm mask betraying none of the turmoil beneath. As the woman disappeared down the hall, he turned his attention to Buzzcut, who now held the gun with both hands, his stance tense. "You're making a mistake," Elijah said quietly, his voice almost sympathetic. Buzzcut smirked, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Big talk for a guy on his knees." Elijah's gaze never wavered. "You think this is about the money, the watches? It's not. You walked into the wrong store." The words hung in the air like a challenge, their weight undeniable. For the first time, Buzzcut's confidence seemed to falter, his grip on the gun tightening as if to compensate. "What the hell are you talking about?" Elijah stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He didn't raise his hands in surrender, nor did he make any overtly threatening gestures. But something in his posture shifted, an intangible aura of control that filled the room. "You don't know who I am," Elijah said, his voice steady and low. "But you're about to find out." Meanwhile, in the hallway, the woman approached the back door cautiously, her knife held at the ready. She peered through the small window, her brow furrowing as she spotted a figure standing just outside. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a black hoodie that obscured most of his face. He stood unnervingly still, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Who the hell are you?" she barked, her voice muffled by the door. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he raised one hand slowly, revealing a single gloved finger that tapped against the glass, once, twice, 3 times. The sound sent a shiver down her spine, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "I said, who are you?" she demanded again, her voice cracking slightly. Without warning, the figure reached up and lowered his hood, revealing a face that was both familiar and haunting. Her breath caught as recognition dawned, and for the first time that night, she felt a stab of genuine fear. Back in the room, Buzzcut was growing increasingly agitated. "I'm not playing games, man," he snapped, waving the gun at Elijah. "Get that safe open now." Elijah didn't flinch, his gaze locked on Buzzcut with unsettling intensity. "Do you know what happens when you corner someone who's got nothing to lose?" Buzzcut scoffed. "You've got plenty to lose, this whole store for starters." Elijah took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "What I have is experience, and you don't walk out of here if I decide. You don't." The words weren't shouted, they weren't laced with threats or bravado, but their quiet conviction was enough to make Buzzcut hesitate, his finger twitching nervously on the trigger. "Stay back," he barked, his voice betraying a note of panic. But Elijah didn't stop. Another step, then another, until he was close enough to see the beads of sweat forming on Buzzcut's brow. "You've got 2 choices," Elijah said, his tone deadly calm. "You walk out of here now, or I make sure you don't walk out at all." Before Buzzcut could respond, a scream echoed from the hallway, a raw, piercing sound that sent a jolt through both men. Buzzcut's head snapped toward the door, his grip on the gun faltering. "What the—" The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, interrupted him. They grew louder, closer, until the figure from the hallway appeared in the doorway. The man's presence was magnetic, his dark eyes scanning the room with a predatory calm. He said nothing, but his mere appearance seemed to drain the room of oxygen. Buzzcut's bravado crumbled, the gun trembling in his hand. "Who the hell are you?" The newcomer's gaze shifted to Elijah, a flicker of recognition passing between them. Elijah's expression remained unreadable, but his voice carried a weight that silenced the room. "He's here for you," he said simply. The words landed like a thunderclap, and for the first time that night, Buzzcut realized he was no longer in control. The room was heavy with tension, the air thick and electric, as Elijah's gaze shifted between Buzzcut, the trembling gun in his hand, and the towering figure now standing in the doorway. The man in the black hoodie exuded a quiet menace, his presence alone enough to fill the room with an almost palpable dread. Who is he?" Buzzcut stammered, his bravado crumbling into fear. Elijah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the man in the hoodie, his expression inscrutable, but his mind racing. He knew who this was, knew him all too well. The memories were buried deep but not forgotten, and seeing him here now was like staring at a ghost. "He's no one you want to meet," Elijah said finally, his voice calm but laced with warning. The man stepped forward, his movements deliberate, as if savoring every moment. He didn't speak, but the weight of his silence was more intimidating than any words could have been. "Stay back," Buzzcut shouted, the gun shaking in his grip. He pointed it at the newcomer, but his trembling hands betrayed his fear. The man stopped, tilting his head slightly as if considering his next move. Then in one fluid motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a black leather glove, slipping it onto his right hand with almost ritualistic precision. "Elijah," the man said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "It's been a long time." Elijah's chest tightened as the sound of his name in that familiar voice sent a chill down his spine. He had spent years distancing himself from this part of his life, creating a facade of sophistication and calm to hide the storm that once raged inside him. But now, faced with the embodiment of his past, he felt the walls of his carefully constructed world begin to crack. "Too long," Elijah replied, his tone measured, but his body coiled like a spring. "I thought you'd moved on." The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "You know I don't let things go that easily." Buzzcut's confusion turned to desperation as he looked between them. "What's going on here? You know this guy?" Elijah ignored the question, his focus entirely on the man in the hoodie. "You're not here for them, are you?" The man chuckled, the sound low and chilling. "No, they're just collateral." His gaze shifted to Buzzcut, then back to Elijah. "I'm here for you." The words hung in the air, their implications cutting through the room like a knife. Buzzcut's panic escalated, and he tightened his grip on the gun. "I'm not sticking around for whatever this is," he snapped, stepping toward the door. Before he could make it, the man moved with startling speed, closing the distance in a heartbeat. He grabbed Buzzcut's wrist, twisting it with a sickening crack that sent the gun clattering to the floor. Buzzcut screamed in pain, cradling his injured arm as he stumbled back. The man turned his attention back to Elijah, his expression calm, but his eyes cold. "No more distractions," he said. "Let's finish this." The tension in the room was suffocating, every second stretching into an eternity as Elijah faced the man who had haunted his nightmares for years. His mind raced, weighing his options, but there was no clear path forward. He was unarmed, outmatched, and cornered, but he wasn't helpless. Elijah took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He raised his hands slightly, a gesture of peace that belied the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever you think I've done, it doesn't have to end like this." The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. You're still trying to talk your way out of things, huh? Some things never change. Elijah's jaw tightened. And you're still clinging to the past. Let it go. Let it go. The man's voice rose, his calm facade cracking. You think I can just forget what you did? You think you can walk away from everything and pretend it never happened? Elijah didn't flinch, though the man's words hit harder than any physical blow could have. I didn't walk away, he said quietly. I built a life, a better one. You could do the same. The man shook his head, his expression hardening. It's too late for that. Too late for you. The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The woman reappeared, her face pale, and her knife nowhere to be seen. She hesitated in the doorway, her eyes darting between the man and Elijah. What's going on? She demanded, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence. The man didn't spare her a glance. Get out, he said simply. The woman froze, torn between her instinct to obey and her fear of losing control. What about him? She asked, nodding toward Elijah. I said, get out. The woman's hesitation lasted only a moment longer, before she turned and fled, her footsteps echoing down the hall. The room fell silent again, the tension thicker than ever. Elijah and the man stood facing each other, the weight of their shared history hanging heavily between them. You've got one chance to walk away, Elijah said finally, his voice calm but firm. Take it, the man laughed, a low, bitter sound. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about walking away, it's about finishing what you started. Before Elijah could respond, the man lunged, his movements swift and precise. Elijah barely had time to react, dodging the initial strike and countering with a move that sent the man stumbling back. For the first time that night, the mask of refinement slipped from Elijah's face, revealing the fierce, unyielding fighter beneath. He hadn't wanted this, hadn't planned for it, but he wasn't about to back down. The fight was brutal and unrelenting, each blow landing with a force that shook the room. Elijah's years of training resurfaced, his movements fluid and controlled, despite the chaos around him. But the man was relentless, his attacks fueled by a rage that seemed almost inhuman. The battle raged on, neither man willing to yield. Every strike, every counter was a test of wills, a clash of past and present that neither could afford to lose. Elijah's breaths came in ragged gasps, his body screaming in protest, but he refused to give in. He thought of his mother, her quiet strength and unwavering belief in him. He thought of the life he had built, the people who depended on him, and he thought of Marcus Daniels, his father's voice echoing in his mind. Never let them see you bleed. With one final surge of strength, Elijah managed to disarm the man, sending his weapons skidding across the floor. He pressed the advantage, pinning the man against the wall and holding him there with sheer force of will. Enough, Elijah said, his voice raw but resolute. It's over, but the man only smiled, a chilling expression that sent a shiver down Elijah's spine. You really think this is over? He whispered. Before Elijah could respond, the man twisted free, a sudden and unexpected move that left him momentarily off balance. The man reached into his pocket, pulling out something small and metallic, a switchblade, its edge gleaming in the dim light. Elijah tensed, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. The room seemed to hold its breath as the two men faced off, the stakes higher than ever. And then, without warning, the man lunged again, the blade arcing through the air in a deadly blur. The man's blade sliced through the air, narrowly missing Elijah's face as he pivoted and blocked the attack with his forearm. The room seemed to blur, every sound muffled except for the heavy breathing and the sharp clang of the knife striking the floor as Elijah managed to knock it away. He didn't waste the moment. Grabbing the man by the collar, he slammed him against the wall with enough force to rattle the shelves. You don't get to walk out of here, Elijah growled, his voice low and dangerous. For the first time, The calm, measured businessman was gone. In his place stood the man he had spent years suppressing, the fighter who had survived against impossible odds. The man coughed, his bravado wavering as he looked into Elijah's eyes, and saw something terrifying, not anger, but cold, calculated control. Elijah had always been precise, his strength lying in his ability to stay 3 steps ahead. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a reckoning. I should have killed you. When I had the chance, the man hissed, his voice thick with venom. Elijah leaned closer, his grip tightening. You already tried that once, remember? It didn't work then, and it won't work now. The twist unfolds. Before Elijah could press further, a sharp, familiar voice cut through the tension. Stop! Don't hurt him! Elijah froze, his head snapping toward the doorway. Standing there, pale and trembling, was the young woman who had fled earlier. Her eyes darted between Elijah and the man, filled with desperation. Elijah frowned. What are you doing here? You had your chance to leave. The woman hesitated, then stepped forward, clutching something in her hands. It was a worn photograph, greased and faded with age. She held it out, her hand trembling. You need to see this, she whispered. Elijah released the man but kept him pinned with a sharp glare as he took the photograph. When he looked down, his breath caught in his throat. The photo was of a younger version of himself, bare-knuckled and battered, standing over a defeated opponent in an underground ring. Beside him, a boy no older than 10 stared up with wide, awestruck eyes. That's you, the woman said, her voice trembling. And that's him! Elijah's gaze snapped to the man now slumped against the wall. Recognition hit him like a freight train. The boy in the photo wasn't just a bystander. He was Marcus Daniels' son, the man now standing before him, filled with years of rage and resentment. You were just a kid, Elijah murmured, his voice tinged with disbelief. The man sneered, his bravado returning in the form of a bitter laugh. And you were supposed to be a hero, my hero. Do you have any idea what it felt like to see you disappear, to watch you abandon everything and leave us all behind? Elijah's stomach churned as the pieces began to fall into place. Marcus Daniels had been a legend in their world, a mentor and father figure who had guided Elijah through his darkest days. But after Marcus's death, Elijah had left the underground life behind, determined to forge a new path. He hadn't looked back, hadn't thought about the consequences of leaving that world behind. I didn't know, Elijah said finally, his voice thick with regret. I didn't know you were still there. If I had... The man cut him off, his voice rising in fury. You didn't care. You had everything handed to you, talent, opportunity, even his respect, and you threw it all away like it was nothing. The power dynamics shift. The weight of the revelation settled over Elijah, but he didn't let it weaken him. Instead, it fueled his resolve. He took a step closer to the man, his expression unreadable. You're right, Elijah admitted. I left. I ran because I couldn't handle the pressure, the violence, the expectations. But that doesn't excuse what you've done, the man scoffed. What I've done, you think I had a choice? I had to fight for everything, every scrap, every chance, while you played dress-up as a businessman. You don't know what it's like to live in the shadow of someone who doesn't even remember you. Elijah's jaw tightened. But before he could respond, the woman interjected. He's been following you for years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Every move, every success, you were his obsession. He thought if he could take you down, it would mean something. The man shot her a warning glare, but she pressed on. You don't have to do this, she said, turning to him. It doesn't have to end like this. The emotional triumph. Elijah stepped back, his gaze softening as he looked at the man. For the first time, He didn't see a rival or an enemy. He saw a lost, angry boy who had been abandoned and left to fend for himself. "I can't undo the past," Elijah said, his voice steady, "but I can take responsibility for it. You're right, I left, and I should have done more to help the people I cared about. But you don't have to let it define you. You don't have to become the thing you hate." The man's defiance wavered, his fists clenching and unclenching as he struggled with the weight of Elijah's words. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension hanging like a fragile thread. Then, with a shaky breath, the man let his shoulders slump. "What am I supposed to do?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. Elijah stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Start over. It's not too late. Atul. The consequences unfold." The moment of calm was shattered by the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The woman glanced toward the window, her eyes widening. "You called the cops?" the man demanded, his voice sharp with panic. Elijah shook his head. "No, but someone must have heard the commotion." The man's expression twisted with anger, but it quickly gave way to resignation. He nodded, his shoulders sagging. "Fine. Let them take me. Maybe it's what I deserve." Elijah hesitated, then made a decision. "I'll talk to them. Explain. What happened? It doesn't have to end with you in a cell." The man's eyes narrowed. "Why would you do that?" "Because I've been where you are," Elijah said simply, "and because I owe it to Marcus." The final suspenseful moment. As the sirens grew louder, Elijah turned to the woman. "You need to go. This isn't your fight." She nodded, her face pale but determined. "Be careful," she said before slipping out the back door. Elijah turned back to the man, his expression resolute. "This is your chance to change. Don't waste it." The man didn't respond, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or the faintest glimmer of redemption. The front door burst open, and the room filled with the blinding light of flashlights and the shouts of officers. Elijah raised his hands, his calm demeanor never wavering as he prepared to face whatever came next. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where the past no longer held him captive, and where he could finally start to make amends. The aftermath of the climactic confrontation began to settle in waves, each one rippling through the lives of everyone involved. As the officers escorted Marcus Daniels, now subdued and silent, out of the luxury store, Elijah stood at the entrance, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The air was heavy with the scent of rain on pavement and the flashing lights of the police cars painted the scene in harsh, rhythmic colors. Elijah watched as Marcus disappeared into the backseat of a patrol car, the door slamming shut with a metallic finality. The man who had been consumed by resentment and revenge now appeared. Smaller, his bravado stripped away to reveal only weariness. Elijah felt no triumph, only a profound sadness for the boy Marcus had once been, and for the choices that had brought him here. Reflections and new beginnings. The following days were a whirlwind of statements, meetings, and quiet moments. Of introspection, Elijah spent hours at the police station recounting the events of that night. He told the truth, every detail, including his own failings. He spoke not to condemn Marcus, but to paint a complete picture of the circumstances that had led them both to this point. It wasn't easy to relive the memories he had worked so hard to bury. Marcus wasn't wrong. Elijah had abandoned the underground world, leaving behind people who had looked up to him. He had rationalized it as self-preservation, but now he saw the collateral damage. Marcus had been left to fend for himself in a brutal environment, where bitterness and violence became his only tools for survival. In the quiet moments between the chaos, Elijah found himself drawn to the photograph the young woman had left behind. He studied it often, tracing the faces, frozen in time. It was a stark reminder of how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. Consequences and justice. Marcus Daniels faced charges for his actions, and though his lawyer argued for leniency, the evidence was damning. However, Elijah intervened. During the sentencing hearing, he stood before the judge and delivered a heartfelt plea, not for Marcus's release, but for an opportunity for rehabilitation. "Marcus and I come from the same place," Elijah said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "We've both made mistakes. The difference is, I had someone who believed in me and showed me there was another way. He never had that chance. I'm asking this court to give him what he's never had, a path to redemption." The judge considered Elijah's words carefully. In the end, Marcus was sentenced to several years in prison, but with the option to participate in a rehabilitation program focused on anger management, mentorship, and reintegration into society. It wasn't an easy path, but it was a chance, a lifeline. Repairing relationships. The young woman who introduced herself as Lila returned to the store a few days after the incident. She seemed hesitant, her hands clasped tightly. In front of her, as she approached Elijah, "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for not giving up on him." Elijah smiled faintly. "It's not about giving up, it's about giving people the chance to make things right." Over time, Lila and Elijah developed a quiet camaraderie. She began working part-time at the store, helping to organize events and connect with the community. She proved to be a natural, her warmth and resilience shining through as she rebuilt her own life alongside Elijah. Elijah also reached out to his estranged family, something he had avoided for years. His sister, who had long been hurt by his self-imposed isolation, welcomed him back with cautious optimism. Their conversations were tentative at first, but grew more open and heartfelt with time. For the first time in years, Elijah felt the weight of loneliness begin to lift. The events at the store sparked conversations throughout the community about race, privilege, and justice. Elijah used the attention to advocate for change, partnering with local organizations to create mentorship programs for at-risk youth. He wanted to ensure that no one else would have to walk the same lonely path Marcus had endured. The luxury store itself underwent a transformation. Elijah revamped its mission, shifting from exclusivity to inclusivity. The store became a hub for community events, showcasing the work of local black artists and designers. It was no longer just a symbol of success, but a testament to resilience and unity. Moments of reflection. One evening, after a particularly long day, Elijah found himself sitting alone in the back office. The photograph lay on the desk. In front of him, its edges worn from handling. He stared at it for a long time, his mind drifting back to the underground rings, to Marcus's father, and to the boy who had watched him with wide, hopeful eyes. He thought about the advice Marcus's father had given him so many years ago. You can't change where you come from, but you can choose where you're going. It was a lesson Elijah had learned the hard way, but one he now carried with him every day. Elijah pulled out a pen and began writing a letter, a message to Marcus. He didn't know if Marcus would read it or even care, but he felt it was important to try. He wrote about the past, about regret, and about hope. Most importantly, he wrote about the future and the choices they both had the power to make. A hopeful future. Months later, Elijah received a letter in return. It was brief but meaningful. Marcus wrote about the rehabilitation program, about the anger he was working to let go of, and about the possibility of a new beginning. I'm not there yet, The letter read, "But I'm trying. Thanks for giving me a reason to." Elijah folded the letter and placed it next to the photograph, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't closure, life was rarely that neat, but it was a step forward, and that was enough. As Elijah locked up the store that evening, he paused to look out at the street. The city was alive with movement, the hum of possibility in the air. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was building something lasting, something meaningful, and, in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.